War poem, Lucas Jones. Two children are born in the desert somewhere. One is called here, the other called there. And here is okay, he's pretty and kind, but there is a monster, he's sick in his mind. Here has a dog and knows birds are for eating. There eats dogs and thinks birds are for keeping. So here builds a city to protect his people, but the shadow is cast over there from the steeple that climbs to the church to protect here from evil. So here builds a city to protect his people, but the shadow is cast over there from the steeple that climbs from the church to protect here from evil. And there says, listen, you're blocking the sun. Here says you deserve it for all that you've done. So there throws a rope to topple the tower. Here retaliates with extraordinary power. And here rains down all the fire from hell and burns all the crop and dries up the well. And there's some confusion who's defending themselves. And here has some books about that on his shelf, but there has no pen and no body to tell. And if it reads black and white, it's probably red. And the living determine the truth of the dead. There's always a feeling of being deceived. And here's an idea you choose to believe in. Is soul determined by where it was born, the language it spoke, or the skin that it's worn? Are we all just text in varying fonts, the same word imprinted with all the same wants and safety and dreams of family trees and children and peace and honey and wheat? But here has a promise it needs you to keep. Just kneel at his flag and he'll give you the dream. Just promise you'll fight whenever he needs. Because there has to die for our living in peace. And it goes on like this for years and years. Here says, it's okay. There's nothing to fear. Just do as I say. God's guidance is clear. And when you get to heaven, I'll be there. I mean, here. This is Ernst Eduard von Rath. He was a German diplomat. And he was a foreign diplomat. He was staged in Paris in July 1938 after having recovered from a pretty long illness. And he was said to be opposed to the more extremist forces in the German government, like fighting against them. More liberal. He even went to a Jewish doctor in Berlin to be treated for his illness that he probably got through homosexual sex, which was very much forbidden at that time and place. And this is Herschel Grünspan. He was a young Polish Jew. Born in 1921, and on November 7th, 1938, he entered the Foreign Office in Paris where von Rath was stationed, and he asked to speak to a member of the office. No one in particular, and he happened to have been sent to von Rath. And he walked in, he saw von Rath, he pulled a revolver out of his pocket, and he fired 5 shots, 2 of which hit Eduard von Rath. So, what happened? We had a Jew committing an arbitrary and deadly attack on a German diplomat on foreign soil, on French soil, and November 7th was the anniversary of the start of the October Revolution. Damn. Germany had at that point been warning of the Jewish threat for years. And here we have a young Jew committing an act of murder on a German diplomat in France. Clearly just that had to be the intention, to sour the relationships between the two neighboring countries. And on the anniversary of the start of the October Revolution, Germany had been warning about the violent connection between communism and Jews for years. And, I mean, 1938, Germany had done all it could, no? Like, even back in June 1938, Hitler himself had forbidden any further anti-Jewish actions. So they had tried. But didn't this prove all that they said? I mean, what was Germany supposed to do after this? It was Germany or the Jews. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. On November 9th, 2 days later, von Rath died. And that day later became known as the Reichspogromnacht. That was the day that this happened. Over 300 Jews were murdered all across Germany. Their shops were broken, their homes were raided, and a bunch of synagogues burned. Many historians see this as the end of the phase where Germany tried to solve the so-called Jewish problem by deportation and started to try and solve it through mass extermination, which would then culminate in the systematic mass destruction of European Jews, the Holocaust. Oh boy, that was a way to tell that story, no? I mean, von Rath was a Nazi. He was a literal Nazi. It does not matter that he was on the more liberal spectrum of the Nazi party. He was a Nazi. He worked for a Nazi, the literal Nazi government. And what else was there to that story? So before this assassination attempt on November 7th, Herschel Grünspan, who was just 17 at the time, had learned that his entire family had been deported from their longtime home in Hanover and sent to Poland, where they hadn't lived in decades, and they were now refugees with no assets whatsoever. This was the so-called Polen-Aktion, 1938, where 17,000 Polish Jews in Germany were arrested and deported, and many of them, because Poland also didn't want to take them, many of them lived for months in makeshift camps on the border between Poland and Germany. And Herschel Grünspan was a 17-year-old living in Paris who had been living there since he was 13 by himself, without his parents, without his sister. And what he did on November 7th was a desperate act. Did he actually believe that shooting a random, honestly unknown and kind of unimportant German diplomat in France was going to solve any of the problems? I mean, probably not. He would have been pretty dumb. But what he had done, or at least the way it was framed, was that the Jew fired the first shot. So the question is, where does history start? And who gets to decide that? Hi, I'm Jara. Some of you might know me as an activist. Some of you might know me from Besetzung gegen Besatzung, the camp in front of the Bundestag. Come by, we're back. It's great. I studied anthropology, I write, I'm a theater person both on stage and off stage. And I do spend quite a lot of time yelling at the German government and the police, so I guess you could call me an activist, even though I don't like that word. At heart, I'm a storyteller. Why? Why do stories matter? Why does the way that we talk about things matter? I mean, facts exist, no? The shots were fired or they were not fired. It's the one way or the other, that's clear. But facts don't exist in a vacuum. We don't simply have a random unassorted number of yes or no. We connect these facts. We sift, we draw connections, or we ignore these connections. We choose which connections to draw, we choose which stories to tell. Our reality is based not just on facts, it is based on facts and stories, and sometimes even more on stories than on facts. So, okay, a shot was fired or a shot was not fired, but why was that shot fired or not fired? Who fired it, and for which reason? What happened before? Does that matter? And who decides if that matters? We look back and we see immense amounts of historic violence and injustices where we think, how the fuck did anyone ever justify that? You look at the transatlantic slave trade, how did anyone ever justify enslaving, abducting, and working to death millions of Africans? How did they justify cutting up and colonizing Africa, the Middle East, Turtle Island, Abya, which most people know as North and South America? How did anyone explain the horrors of the Holocaust? The so-called witch burnings, the list goes on. There's so many historic injustices because these injustices, they were explained. And they had their justifications, and we need to be specific here because English has a double entendre here. These horrors were justified in the sense that they were ascribed a justification, not in the sense that they were correct. They weren't. But they were explained to be somehow. They were made to seem often not only unavoidable, but morally correct. And my goal here with this presentation is to explain some of these narratives. How is this violence justified? Because often enough, these narratives, they're kind of the same throughout history. We think something is new, but it's not. It showed up 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 400 years ago. It haunts us. And I'm going to give you a couple of different narratives, and I've ascribed them all names. So the narrative I described around Herschel Grünspan, I'm going to call that, they fired the first shot. And a lot of times these narratives, they have two sides. No, they're two sides of the same coin. They have a story about them and they have a story about us. So this, they fired the first shot, that's a story about them. What's the story about us? Self-defense. Okay, so they fired the first shot. This narrative was used in the Reichspogromnacht. But for instance, it was also used at the genocide of the Herero Nama, the so-called first genocide of the 20th century, one of Germany's, and it followed an armed uprising, which was led by Samuel Maherero, who was a Herero captain, and he killed around 140 Germans in this armed uprising against the German colonial regime. And that was then used to justify the genocide of 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama population between 1904 and 1907. Now, the narratives that I'm going to be showing you today, I've split them into three groups. So the first, they fired the first shot, is a narrative about time. It's the question about when does something happen? When does it start? And then we'll be going through narratives around land, and then narratives around people. So the next narrative, so the narrative about time, the first one, they fired the first shot. Let's go to narratives around land. Who knows this picture? I spot an American. So this is a symbolic painting of something called Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was a belief, a slogan of the colonization of specifically what then later became the US. And it was the belief that, I have to be so careful about my cursor because I don't know what's going on. That it was not only the duty, not only the right, but the duty and the destiny of, specifically in this case, the Protestant colonizers that settled in Turtle Island in what later became to be known as the US, to colonize the world under them. And this goes back to this psalm. She'll have dominion from sea to sea and from the river until the ends of the earth. If I say those words in other order, the police might arrest me here in Berlin. And this is from a psalm in the Bible. So I want to be very clear. Religion is something that has a great power. It's a great source of meaning and justice for many people, and it's great for abuse. It's really easy to be abused. European colonizers abused Christianity, as we see here. And Manifest Destiny, I'd had another slogan that was from sea to shining sea, and there was really this idea that this is the job that God gave us. And I said, like, every religion can be abused, and then people are usually like, oh, but Buddhism, yes, also, oopsie. No. Okay, so the presentation went a bit off here, that's fine. This narrative I call God said so. God said so, so it's okay. It's great. It's really hard to argue with that one. And yeah, something happened to the presentation. But yeah, no, Buddhists can also use it. Every religion can use it. This is a protest from Rohingya that are currently living under an apartheid system in Myanmar that is, yes, forced by Buddhists. And the nice thing about this narrative is that it expands effortlessly. Because you don't really have to justify, oh, God said so. Well, you believe it or you don't. It's very valuable. God said so. So, the next narrative. This is connected. So these three about land. There's three about land and they're all connected. This is a caricature from the Berlin Africa Conference back in 1848, which is when Otto von Bismarck gathered European and Ottoman leaders here in Berlin to slice up Africa and to make sure that nobody was stepping on each other's toes of the colonizers. You see who's not present on that picture is actual people from Africa. And what this one says, Africa is just, it's a cake. It's just that, it's just there to be given away. And this narrative I'm going to call Terra Nullius, the empty land. That one's easy, no? If something is empty, if something doesn't have anyone on it, well, it doesn't hurt anyone to take it. If it's empty, if it belongs to nobody, it's up for grabs. The question with this one is who has the right to land? The one who lives there, the one who owns it, the one who paid money for it. Most people here in Berlin will be living in rented houses. You live somewhere, you take care of it, but it's not yours. And the term for terra nullius goes back to the Latin term of res nullius, which referred to wild animals that anyone could shoot. Terra nullius is actually an invention of early colonizers of Abya Yala, and it derives its power really from obfuscation. It hides the native by simply pretending they're not there. They simply make them invisible. And thus, occupation and land theft become a victimless crime. This narrative was really important in shaping the legal arguments around colonization, because they said, well, there's no one there, so it's up for grabs, so we can take it, so legally it's fine. And of course, it's not true. So this is a map of Africa pre-colonization. There was hundreds of smaller and larger kingdoms. And most people have never seen this map or a comparable map. We only know the map of Africa after 1848, as if history started then. What terra nullius does, this is a quote from Edward Said, is it cancels and transcends an actual reality by means of a future wish, that the land may be empty for development by those more deserving of it. So it's a wish, discursive wish, a reality that you speak into, a truth that you speak into reality. By saying there's no one there, you can justify kicking those that were there out. And so there's no one there. That's the story. No one on this land. And if, so it's okay to take the land. And if someone was there, well, what do you do then? What you do then is you go to... So this is a painting of Christopher Columbus landing on what later became the Americas. And you can see the nice European conquistas. And way in the back, oh, there's people. So it wasn't an empty land. No? So what do you do then? There was people there. Well, but you still want to steal the land. You're a colonizer. That's kind of your whole thing. What do you do? Well, the land looks different than yours. The land is maybe cultivated in a way you can recognize. Or maybe it's just not cultivated at all. And this dude, is the narrative of the bad steward, which is another one that goes back to the Bible. If you look it up now, you'll find like a lot of business economic stuff, of like stewarding a company, but it goes back to the parable of the bad steward, the one that maybe takes care of the land but doesn't do it well. And if someone doesn't take care of something valuable, I mean, you have to make sure that it doesn't break. No, like if a kid is holding a precious object and it's about to break it, well, we take it away from them. No, we don't want it to be broken. The early European colonizers that arrived in the Americas, the indigenous people of the Americas, they had a very different agricultural system than the Europeans. And the Europeans could not recognize that as an agricultural system because it wasn't something that was legible to them. So they just said, well, they don't take care of the land. There's so much of it. And you could do so much with it, but they don't. And because they don't, well, then it's our right to do it ourselves. To which, of course, the natives say this. So, those are the three narratives around land. God said so. The terra nullius, the empty land, and the bad steward, of which, of course, the flip sides are God said so, God gave it to us. Flip side of that being God did not give it to you. Terra nullius, the land was empty. Well, now it's not anymore. That means it's up for us to take it. And then, of course, the bad steward, the flip side of that. It's like, oh, you are being a bad steward. We can do better than that. And thus we deserve it. Now, let's move on to narratives about people. Who's seen this? Who here reads German? Okay, a couple of people. I see one person who's had the misfortune to see this. So this is an article that was written last November, I think. Oh, I forgot to put the date on there. In Focus magazine. And it reads, die Juden oder die Agro-Araber, wir müssen uns entscheiden, wen wir halten wollen. Or in English, the Jews or the Agro-Arabs, we have to decide who we want to keep. So, one of the things power systems always have to do is to separate people into groups. No? Divide and conquer, the first step, you have to divide them. In this one, we see a divide into not just two groups, but into three. We have an us. We need to decide who to keep. Who is the us in this scenario? The Germans. And we have two thems. First of them is the Jews. And the second is the Agro-Arabs. And aggro is like a really derogatory way in German to say aggressive. It's like you're not even being respectful enough to say the whole word aggressive, so you say aggro. This framing of a German us, a Jewish them, and an Agro-Arab them magnificently manages to exclude both Jews and Arabs from the German us. You've got 2 for 1. You excluded 2 groups at once. Defines them both as distinct and separate categories from each other and, of course, from the German. Distinct, unchangeable, inherent categories. Putting people into them, ooh, bad. First step to dehumanization. And this one here, you have one group, the Jews, stylized as needing of protection, and the other group, the Agro-Arabs, as dangerous. It's obvious, simply from the way that how this is framed, how this is written, that it is intended to, with the reader, have the effect of like, oh no, of course we don't want the Agro-Arabs, they're aggro, they're aggressive, they're dangerous. So one is a needing of protection and one is a threat, which you can also see in this picture. Now, the author of this is Jan Fleischhauer. He's a so-called journalist. He was a member of the German Islam Conference for 3 years, which is supposed to bring together members of like the Muslim faith in Germany and white Germans. He made his career writing, beginning his writing about like within leftist spaces, and now he writes stuff like the Jews or the Agro-Arabs, and also he has a whole call. If you want to go down a rabbit hole, he has a whole blog where he writes stuff like "Mehr Trumpwagen," which is like, oh, we need to dare to be more like Trump. He was with Spiegel for almost 30 years, which is a magazine that belongs to Axel Springer, obviously a defamatory, racist, rag tabloid. Now he's with Focus, which is also where the Jews or the Agro-Arabs column was published, which belongs to Hubert Media Verlag, which got rich off stolen Jewish money back in the Nazi times. I mean, we are in Germany. Who are you if you're a successful company and you don't have some Nazi money? You need to keep up with tradition. And this is the spot where I had to stop myself going down a massive rabbit hole, because that's actually very interesting of like who owns all of these media companies and how are they all connected to each other. So if you want to like waste 3 hours tonight and get really mad, I suggest you look it up. And I suggest you remember that name, because we want to be keeping receipts on the people who say this stuff. Even though I'm sorry that I had to put his face up here. Look at it. Okay, so first important step to these sort of narratives around people: divide and conquer. You need to divide them. Okay, so let's go to the first narrative. Has anyone seen this? Yes, you did. I saw it yesterday evening at Naturkundemuseum in the subway station. And I was like, great, you're writing my presentation for me. So it reads, please mind the gap zwischen Protest und Gewalt, so between protest and violence. And it is an advertisement campaign by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is the, I always forget the English word for Stiftung. Foundation. That is close to the CDU, the Conservative Party, and Demokratie schützt Demokratie, democracy protects us, protect democracy. And what does it do here, narratively? It delineates protest and violence. It says, mind the gap, there's a gap. Those are 2 separate things. Which, of course, what it's saying is like, oh no, protest is part of democracy. We love protest. Protest is great. Violence, that's not okay. That's bad. And this is up in Berlin right now, so we know exactly what this is a reaction to. But this is not, again, a new phenomenon. So this is a caricature from 1967 from the US. It was published in the Birmingham News by cartoonist Charles Brooks. And it reads at the top, "I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow." And that obviously is Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King. And you can see that does not look like the site of a nonviolent protest, no? There's some fires in the back, there's a bunch of stuff on the floor, there's someone lying injured on the floor, there's a car burning. What's depicted is the site of a riot. And the caricature plays with exactly this gap intended between, what is seen as a protest, as legitimate, and what is seen as violence. And this narrative, I'm going to call good protester, bad protester. And this one is one of the central liberal narratives. How does it work? It distracts. It distracts from the reason for any protest by focusing overly just on the methods, and thus it delegitimizes the protest. It forever critiques how something is said and done, and never allows time and space to look at why something is said and done. And this one is all over the place. This one takes so many forms. This one takes the form of, I agree with them, but I would never go to a protest where they just throw around words like apartheid. Someone said that to me once. This takes the form of, they would convince more people if they would be more polite. This one takes the form of, democracy has space for dialogue, always, obviously. But don't yell at me. And we always know that obviously this is a distraction. There is never an actual invitation there. The problem is not the method. And this narrative is actually as old as democracy itself and the idea of civility itself. And what it does is it positions resistance to a system, to a status quo, as violence. It will always distract from the violence of the system by focusing just on the violence of the protest. Okay. The next two ones are pretty well known narratives, so I'm just gonna do them shortly. This one, you see here, this is another one from a US context. You see two poor little men in stars and stripes carrying a bunch of non-white people on their backs, and then all the way in the back, I don't know if you can read that, it says civilization. So it's the white man carrying the non-white men towards civilization. And this one is called The White Man's Burden. And it goes back to a poem that was so widely satirized and so ridiculed because it is so racist. It's from 1898. That basically says, what is the burden of the white man? The burden of the white man is to bring all of these non-white cultures into civilization. And that's just something that the white man has to do. It's his burden, and he will take it on graciously. Then, very similar to that, we have here another one from 1899, Barbarie et Civilisation. And you see the exact same thing depicted. But once so this was in the context of the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken, the US invasion of the Philippines. You have a Southeast Asian looking man attacking a European looking man. That's barbarism. And then you have the exact same thing the other way around. That's civilization. So, as I said, pretty simple. This is the civilization versus barbarism narrative that we also see play out all over the place. Who's civilized? Who isn't? Who gets to decide that? Okay. And then the last one is, last one's a fun one. Kept a fun one for the end. Who has ever heard the term black identity extremist? Yeah, no, I hadn't either beforehand. So what the fuck is that? A black identity extremist is someone who retaliated against law enforcement with premeditated retaliatory lethal violence due to perceptions of police brutality. Some dude in the FBI around 2017. No, actually that's a quote from Good Protester, Bad Protester, an article in the Harvard Law Review by Swati Kela. Retaliating against law enforcement with premeditated retaliatory lethal violence due to perceptions of police brutality. On a personal note, police complaining that people view them as violent and brutal is always the funniest thing to me. Because it's like, well, I don't know, man. Why do we think that way? Like, you poor bastard, that it hurts your feeling that we don't like that you beat us up. I don't know. Last week we currently have an exhibition at the camp in front of Bundestag, Besatzung of 1 year Palestine Solidarity Movement in Berlin. And there's a lot of police violence in there. And the poor police is really upset about it because they think it's not fair to them. No. I call this narrative. So, no. 2 more slides. So, what is a black identity extremist? It's this. It's this guy. Or it's this woman. So this term came up within the Black Lives Matter movements in the US. And what does it do? I call this narrative, it's new, it's special, and it's scary. The slightly more anthropological term for that is defamiliarization. So what it does is it invents a whole new category of people, of like a new term that is meant to instill fear. And it does that through not having it be like, oh, these are people who are mad about police brutality protesting, like, oh no, they belong to this ominous new group that you have never heard of before because they literally just invented the term. And we're going to cast them as suspicious. And we're going to cast this entire group as needing of supervision because they're dangerous to normal society. These aren't your neighbors, your classmates, your people. No, these are black identity extremists, for instance. And they need to be supervised, they need to be suppressed. And in the final step of this defamiliarization, this casting of a new category, new people, they need to be eradicated because they're a danger to society. So this is a US-specific example, but Berlin actually also does that. There's a Berlin-specific example. And that one usually surprises people. That one is clan criminality. That's a completely new and invented term that in Berlin specifically is used and abused, like the legal term of clan criminality is used and abused purely to surveil and police Arabs in Berlin. And that's something that the police just admits to. And they use it as a legal tool to justify just all kinds of racist violence, racial profiling. There's an amazing essay about that in Arab Berlin. It's a book that came out last year. The essay is by Nadia Samour. It's called How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? The Arab and the Law in Berlin. And the police just admit that they have invented this category of clan criminality. And if you say this to white Germans, they're like, no, but clan criminality exists. Well, I mean, it's a social construct, just like most things are a social construct. Because clan criminality actually, in like criminal legal terms, is already subsumed under organized criminality. So why do you need this extra term of clan criminality? What does it do? Is it casts an entire group, in this case an entire family unit, of one specific racial and ethnic background, which in Berlin is mostly Arab people, but also like originally was invented for Turkish people, as, again, outside of society and dangerous to it. Now we have these narratives. Narrative around time. They fired the first shot. We have the narrative around land. God said so. Terra nullius, the empty land. And the bad steward. And then we have the narratives around people, which are the good protester, bad protester narrative, the white man's burden, the civilization versus barbarism, and it's new, it's special, and it's scary. We have a couple of honorable mentions. The emotional other, the uncivilized other, the dangerous other. These are all of these narratives, they are connected to each other and they are still distinct in important ways. And then we had resistance as attack. That is subsumed under they fired the first shot. But we also have resistance as hateful. And we have, but we did the best we could. But we tried being nice. Now, I want to finish with another poem that is called Palestinian Occupation of Israeli Territory. It's by Rayat al-Madhoun. I'm not going to read the whole poem, but it's on his Instagram, you can find it. Palestinian Occupation of Israeli Territory. Editor's note. This text has been rewritten and redrafted multiple times due to the lack of freedom of expression in Germany regarding Palestine and to be allowed for publication. I, Rayat al-Madhoun, on behalf of myself and all honorable Palestinians who stand against the persecution of Israeli citizens, demand that the State of Palestine do the following. Immediately withdraw the Palestinian Defense Forces, PDF, from occupied Israeli territory. Stop Palestinian Defense Forces tanks from invading Israeli cities, towns, and villages. Halt Palestinian F-16s from bombing Israel. Immediately release more than 10,000 Israeli detainees held by Palestine without charge or trial. Cease the Palestinian Defense Forces' military response to the Israeli Intifada and stop firing live ammunition at Israeli stone-throwing children. Stop declaring Palestine as a Muslim state for all Muslims in the world. Stop racist politics towards Israeli citizens under Palestinian occupation and remove the apartheid wall from occupied Israeli territories. Palestine must work to return more than 10 million Israeli refugees from refugee camps in neighboring countries to their homes from which they were displaced in the 1948 War of Liberation. Western countries should cease their unconditional support for Palestine and the double standards regarding the Palestinian occupation of Israel. Stop the mainstream media from being blindly biased in favor of the Palestinian occupation state. And individuals and institutions worldwide should boycott Palestine culturally and economically to increase pressure to end the Palestinian occupation of Israeli territories. Rayat al-Madhoun, September 2022. The way we talk about stuff matters. Narratives matter because they're the way we explain the world to ourselves and to each other and to those that come after us. And some of these narratives work really, really well because we do not even realize that what we are telling ourselves is story. We think so often that what we hear, what we are being told, is fact. And there's facts in there. But the way that we connect the facts to each other, that is what narrative is. And it's important to know these narratives because by knowing them, you can recognize them. And by recognizing them, you can start to dismantle them. Because all of these narratives are, in their core, made to justify systems of oppression, systems of violence, war, apartheid, and genocide. So it's important to know what we're looking at, because otherwise, how are we even ever going to start arguing against it? Thank you. I don't know if we want to do like a question. I don't know if anyone has questions or something like that. Yes.
Perfect. Sorry, my voice is gone. Amazing. Thank you so much. This is super important. It's less of a question. I just wanted to add another level to it from like Turtle Island. Thomas King is a great author, Cherokee writer, who talks about this. He writes a great book called The Truth About Stories. And I think just sort of to hold ourselves accountable as well, especially as you edge closer into liberalism, is the narratives that we tell ourselves also about like First Nations and the noble like savagery is something he talks about a lot. So I think a lot of this that you talked about was incredible. I just wanted to kind of bring ourselves into accountability in the sense of like sometimes when we look at indigenous people and we look at their practices, it's just noble, but still with the savagery term, we do such an injustice of actually talking about the stewardship, as you were mentioning, of the land that took place. So just to add, it's not just a thing that systems or actors of the oppression system that do it, we do it ourselves as well, and to always kind of question that as well, even when it's like in a form of compliment or in the way that we see as compliment. Like, as a Lebanese person, but without an accent, I'm like a reformed Arab, like it's fine, I'm okay, like you're one of the nice ones, and just sort of deconstructing like what we consider as compliments within a story as well. I think just wanted to add to this great presentation. That was it. Thanks.
Yeah, we can fall into it ourselves. I see it a lot, especially with the good protester, bad protester, that we're like, oh no, we have to protest, but in this way, or in this way, and this way. And what you're doing is, again, suppressing resistance to a system of violence and putting the form of resistance, making that more important than what it's resisting against. So, thank you. Okay. Come to camp. We're in front of Bundestag. It's great.